Today on Beyond 6 Seconds.
One of the key advantages of blockchain technology is around keeping track of where things are going, what things are happening in a far more secure way through the power of an entire network working together rather than relying on one single entity. And if that single entity fails, then you have a big problem.
Welcome to Beyond 6 Seconds, the podcast that goes beyond the 6-second first impression to share the extraordinary stories and achievements of everyday people. I'm your host, Carolyn Keel. My guest on the podcast today is Fennie Wang. Fennie is a lawyer by trade and currently works with a startup called the IXO Network. We're going to talk about how she got started working with a really exciting technology called blockchain and how she's using that technology in her startup's latest project with UNICEF. Fennie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Carolyn, for having me.
So for those who are listening who may not be familiar with blockchain, can you give us an overview of what it is and how it works?
Yeah, sure. The way I think about blockchain is it's quite like the internet, right? If you think about the internet as a network or web of different computers that are processing all different kinds of information. So blockchain is very much similar in that kind of design, but people have said that blockchain is a internet of value.
So a lot of times we think of value as something like currency, but it sounds like it could really be anything that has economic worth or significance in a transaction between two parties. I see.
It's specifically around transacting value and being able to record that in a way that doesn't rely on one entity, but a whole network of computers, sometimes called nodes, that work towards ensuring that transactions are correct and putting it together into a ledger. You're using math to do that, instead of relying on the authority or trust in one single entity like a bank to say this is a correct transaction.
It's different from, say, online payments and the currencies that we normally think of, because I tend to think of blockchain, I think of, cryptocurrencies and that types of finance. Is it based on increased security, or how is it different from what we usually use?
So when you have a single entity that decides if something is accurate or not accurate, that holds all your money, it's very susceptible to being hacked. So all you have to do is go and rob one bank. Whereas in the case of a blockchain network, the information is distributed across that entire network of computers. Mm-hmm. So each computer will hold a copy of what's going on in the network, what the transactions are. So it has much greater resiliency, which improves the security of the whole network. So I think that is one of the key advantages of blockchain technology, is around keeping track of where things are going, what things are happening in a far more secure way through the power of an entire network working together rather than relying on one single entity. And if that single entity fails, then you have a big problem. So we've seen that with, for example, the Equifax hack, right? So they're one big central entity that keeps track of everyone's credit data. And if they get hacked, then all that information becomes vulnerable and insecure. Whereas with blockchain, you've got to go hack multiple entities and multiple computers to really take over the information that's been recorded. So it's a lot harder to do that.
Oh, I see. I feel like I've only been hearing about blockchain in the media relatively recently. Is it something new, or has it been around for a while?
So Bitcoin was the first case of blockchain as we know it. So the technical white paper that kind of spurred people came out in 2008. It was written by this anonymous person or persons using a pseudonym called Satoshi Nakamoto. Oh. So we don't really know who this person or group of persons are. It's a very short paper. You can still read it. It's on the internet. That came out with this idea of, well, why don't we use a network and use math as the way to confirm transactions of value rather than relying on one entity that holds, kind of all the keys. So people started working on this concept and building on it. And it's very much a community project in that sense, where anyone can be involved and help confirm transactions with the code. So that started kind of evolving in the past 10 years. And now everyone's heard of Bitcoin because the price has been skyrocketing in the last couple of months. Right. So that's definitely garnered some mainstream attention around certainly Bitcoin, but hopefully around blockchain in general, because you can have many different kinds of blockchains that don't have anything to do with Bitcoin because they'll be their own set of computers and networks, and they'll have their own use cases that they're optimized for, and they'll have their own cryptocurrencies associated with them. So I think that's super cool that we're going to see a whole host of different cryptocurrencies and different blockchains and different use case applications and different technologies emerging.
Wow. Yeah, a lot of opportunities to apply that technology. Very interesting. So how did you first get involved in the blockchain space?
So I do have a pretty crazy story around this. I had read about blockchain. I was very interested in the concept. I was going around to different events trying to learn more about it. You know, life is completely random, right? Things never happen as you think.
Right.
It's never linear. So I went to a wedding. One of the girls I roomed with was running a Toastmasters program. And for those of you who don't know what Toastmasters is, it's a public speaking program. It's been around for decades, I think. And then she was like, have you heard of Silk Road? And I said, yeah, I think I've heard of Silk Road. And for those who aren't familiar, Silk Road was one of the first dark web applications. It was basically eBay to buy and sell drugs, but in a more transparent way because you can leave reviews, and they used only Bitcoin as the payment mechanism. So this was in 2010 to 2012, I think. So very early on in the Bitcoin story, since Bitcoin only came out as an idea in 2008. So Silk Road became quite infamous as one of the first operations. And so there was a lot of law enforcement's crackdown on this. And Ross Ulbricht is the creator of Silk Road. And he got a double life sentence, I believe, without possibility of parole on account of all these charges around conspiracy to traffic narcotics because he was operating a platform that was selling drugs.
Right.
So there's been a lot of media around Ross's story and why Ross created Silk Road and so forth. So he's definitely a very interesting character. And I didn't know this, but until this past summer, 2017, he was in a federal prison in downtown Manhattan, apparently where El Chapo is also held. So yeah.
Oh, wow. So you're talking with your friend about Silk Road and Ross Ulbricht. And then what happened?
So she's like, well, I met Ross in this federal prison in downtown Manhattan because he's part of a Toastmasters prison program. And so I was like, oh, well, that's very interesting. And I was like, well, I'd love to maybe meet him because he's a fascinating person. So that's kind of how it got started. I went initially as part of the Toastmasters program. And then I met his mom and I met his friend, Tatiana Morose, who is a big podcaster in the Bitcoin community. And the mom was like, well, do you want to come back and see Ross? Because, you know, you live in Manhattan and he's mostly very bored, has no one intelligent to talk to in prison. And I'm a lawyer, so I'm an attorney, which makes it relatively easy to go to prison and say you're seeing your clients. So I started to hang out with Ross in prison and getting to know him. And he's a very intelligent guy, very thoughtful. And for him, Silk Road was a protest. It was a kind of experiment in are there alternative ways in how we think about the war on drugs and, you know, a libertarian protest in some ways as well. And I'm just a very curious person and I want to learn different viewpoints and what motivates people to do different things. But through knowing Ross, Tatiana had invited me to a party. This was back in May of 2017 to meet, you know, more crypto people. So I'm usually late to parties, but for whatever reason, this time because of my schedule, I ended up being there early. So the first person there ended up being my founder, Sean Conway, and I was the second person there. And the host of the party is now a good friend and mentor as well. So that's kind of how I got into that space. And next thing you know, over a glass of sake, Sean's asking me to come to South Africa, to Cape Town, where he's been building on a blockchain protocol for collecting and measuring social impact data. They've got a live pilot project backed by UNICEF. And so, you know, next thing you know, I'm off to Cape Town. I'm running around the world between Switzerland and Bermuda and elsewhere in Mexico, you know, at these different blockchain and conferences and meetings, some pretty amazing and incredibly intelligent and thoughtful people. So it's been a ride.
Wow, that is a crazy story. And it's literally going from having an interest in the subject to having that happenstance opportunity to meet someone who's used blockchain and use that for, some may say, more nefarious purposes or a protest or however you look at it. And then that interesting transition from learning about it from him and then having another opportunity to start using blockchain for like social impact, which is just so interesting how the technology has so many different applications.
Yes, exactly.
What was it about the blockchain technology that really resonated with you personally and kind of inspired you to start learning about it and working with it?
There's definitely something very interesting that's happening with all technologies, there's the technical part, which is complicated and there's lots of things going on there. But what makes the technology really click and take over, it's the social engineering part of it.
Oh, tell me more about that.
So this idea that it's about harnessing sort of the crowd, and there's more security if you can harness an entire network of people working on something versus rely on one entity, right? So there's something quite fascinating there. And also the idea around tokenization, which means to create a digital asset out of a real life asset and turning that into a token that can be traded peer to peer without any kind of intermediary. And now you're creating new forms of value and new forms of capital. And I find that really, really fascinating. So the whole narrative around a lot of the blockchain and decentralization movement is how do we introduce more resiliency into our socioeconomic and technical systems? Because the more concentrated your power or your business operations are in one entity, the more fragile it is, right? There's one financial instrument, and if that gets messed up, then it can create domino effects. So we saw that with 2008 and the financial crisis. I don't think it's necessarily a coincidence that 2008 was a watershed year in terms of we have a financial crisis, and then we have the Bitcoin white paper that comes out and says, here's a new idea around money and value and how we transact. So I think that aspect of it I find really, really fascinating. Like, where does this go from a longer big picture? People get fazed by, oh, what's the price of Bitcoin? Is it going to go up? Am I going to make money? And I think that's quite short-sighted. And I'm glad people are rich off it. I mean, maybe that's a newfound source of wealth to fund these more interesting kind of long-term use cases around blockchain. But that's where I'm really in it for, is seeing how that develops in terms of how it can restructure the way we think about value and we think about capital.
Interesting. You're currently working on a blockchain project with UNICEF.
Yes.
Tell me about the focus of that project and how you got involved with that.
Yeah, so I can't take the credit for this. It's definitely Sean. We are UNICEF's first and so far only blockchain investment. So UNICEF Ventures is an internal venture fund that's privately funded within the UNICEF umbrella. And they also have their own innovation unit. So I think that's super cool about UNICEF being this large, you think this kind of governmental, quasi-governmental organization, but they're doing some pretty cool work around technology, and blockchain and crypto has been a particular interest area of the bright minds behind UNICEF innovation, such as Chris Fabian and Sinisa Grote, who've been our champions within the space. So Sean got connected through UNICEF. He's been working in the social enterprise and development and blockchain space for quite some time. So he's been in blockchain space for the past 4 or 5 years. And before that, in the public health and social enterprise space for his entire career. So the past, basically 25 years. So he's definitely got a lot of street cred in both fields. So he got involved with UNICEF to look at how we can tokenize or digitize preschool attendance records. So early childhood education is a high priority area in South Africa.
Right.
Because you can get a lot more long-term social benefits when you start educating kids at an early age. So there's an outsized economic and social return to that investment. So the government of Western Cape has a subsidy program for preschool operators, whereby if you can show proof of attendance, you can receive subsidies from the government to run these preschool programs and so forth. So we saw an opportunity to look at how we can apply these new technologies to make that process more efficient and transformative. So before, teachers were filling out these forms by hand, so that takes up a lot of time. It's also susceptible to lots of mistakes and documentation records getting lost and not being, very shareable, just paper documents, right? So we said, look, why don't we start collecting data using these simple mobile phones? You're reducing the attendance taking time for the teachers. We're going to collect this data in a standardized data format that's going to be easy for people to analyze and share the data. And we're going to use blockchain as a mechanism to record this in a way that can't be changed or reversed. So you have confidence in that data being accurate. what's cool about blockchain is that it's meant to be a record that can't be just changed by anyone. You create confidence in the accuracy of the data so that when you come back and try to audit the data, all the information is there. So that's been a running pilot since November 2016. We've digitized more than 50,000 attendance records to date, and we're looking to scale up that project in 2018.
Wow. So then using the mobile phones instead of filling out the paper forms, do the teachers or the students or the parents use the phones to input data? How does that chain work?
It's a simple app. And another layer to it is providing digital IDs to the teachers and to the students. So you can pull up, here's this child's information, and there's an ID associated with the teacher who's marking the attendance. There's an ID associated to the preschool center. And there's also automatic data that we call metadata that gets captured by the phone, such as when the attendance record was marked, where the attendance record was marked. So these are also rich information that can make sure that your data is accurate, reducing inaccuracies, reducing fraud, again, improving the trustworthiness and the accuracy of the data that you're collecting in a cost-efficient way.
I see. That added security, that reliance on the accuracy of the data, and especially with a large data set like that. Interesting. Wow. What kind of impacts have you seen on that project so far?
As I said, we digitized more than 50,000 attendance records, and we're seeing that the average reduction times for teachers is quite a number of man hours per day, and also in terms of the administration per week. And we're looking to constantly improve that. So using additional forms of technology to automate the qualifications for receiving the subsidies, right? So aggregating all the attendance records into something called a smart contract, which is a computer code that automatically can execute parts of a real life contract, which is super cool.
Wow.
Right? So let's say the government says, okay, give me 1,000 attendance records and I'll give you a $10,000 subsidy.
Okay.
Right? So the computer code can then execute on that. Okay, boom, 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 boom. I've got 1,000 attendance records that look good. And then we can say, oh, look, this preschool center now qualifies for this $10,000 subsidy. And you can submit that to the government. So you're creating efficiency in terms of claiming things, but you're also increasing, again, the audit trails and the confidence that you have in the data and the mechanisms.
Interesting. In addition to blockchain being used to transfer funds and currencies, it's really that transfer of data that's crucial to it.
Yeah, we see blockchain as the tool that allows you to marry performance accounting with financial accounting. So performance accounting in the sense that we've got data that says I did X. And then you can trigger that into the value transaction that says, okay, now I'm going to reward you for X. So that's super exciting.
As I'm thinking about the complexity of a project like that, and I know you mentioned that your training is that you're a lawyer, what skills did you either use from your law training or other skills that you developed to kind of make that transition to now working with blockchain?
That's a great question because there's so much legal stuff happening and regulatory stuff happening in the space. I actually enjoy being a lawyer now because you actually get to use your brain and think like, oh, what is this new thing? And how do we structure solutions around it? How do we be creative around it? So you might have heard of something called ICOs or initial coin offerings. That's been all the rage also in the past year or so.
Yeah. And how does an ICO work?
So basically projects are coming out and saying, well, we're issuing this token that's going to be required to run the operations of our blockchain application. And so this is a form of crowdfunding. We're coming to the public to raise money because this is a community effort. And so regulators have come in and said, well, aren't these securities? Aren't you offering equity to the public, which is a regulated space? And normally, if you do that, you have to adhere to all these rules around disclosure because regulators want to protect against mom and pop being, screwed over by bad investment, right? Because they've been fed bad information and so forth. So that's been a lot of stuff that's been going on, trying to figure out what's the right regulatory approach. And I think, globally, different regulators are trying to figure out what's the right way to regulate. Some are taking a more proactive approach and an open-minded approach because they don't want to kill the innovation. They want to encourage capital raising because it's generally good for the economy, but at the same time balancing against the public policy concerns around protecting the mom and pops. So there's been a ton of work that's been done around and thinking that's been done around what's the proper way to do new forms of fundraising for these types of decentralized and open source blockchain projects. So it's super fun. I used to be a securities lawyer. I hated my job. I was just, like sleeping under my desk in this glass tower, and you're like, oh, I want to get out of here. And now I really love being a securities lawyer because you're dealing with really novel questions and hopefully be able to shape a little bit about in terms of how the law and the regulations evolve. So that's really exciting.
Interesting. That's really cool. So clearly your work with UNICEF is having a very specific positive impact on the preschool children in South Africa. How do you see blockchain, other opportunities for it to be used to create more positive impacts on society?
I think beyond just this particular use case, we see so many different possibilities of how we can make data around what people are doing easier to collect and more abundant and higher quality. There's a lot of talk, I think, around sustainable investment, social impact investment. You might have heard of terms like ESG investing, which stands for, I think, environmental, social, and governance investing. And I was just speaking to someone the other day who's in the business. He was saying that for a lot of folks in the space, they feel like it's almost verging on fraud, where someone says, I am a socially responsible investment, put your money in these companies. But when in fact, there's no data at all to prove that or to back that claim. And you've got a lot of fund managers that are out there touting, we're a green fund, we're a social impact fund, without any kind of data to support that really. And they're still charging high fees for, managing those kind of investment portfolios. So if we can provide tools that any project can use to collect data, in a cost-effective manner and have that data be shareable and then get funded based on proving your project achievements and project outcomes and impacts, I think you're looking at a whole new unlocking of capital towards these types of projects. We have the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN has come out with, and we're still trillions of dollars short of achieving them because if you can't measure where things are going, then people aren't going to put resources towards it. So bringing visibility to what people are doing is going to help in terms of unlocking more resources and then being able to tie funding directly to results and impact. I think that's going to be incredibly powerful. So one of the partners that we work with is New America Foundation, which is a think tank in DC that's backed by the likes of Google and Gates Foundation. And one of their projects is called Bretton Woods 2, which focuses on reframing social impact investing as a form of portfolio risk mitigation and risk management. So if you're a long-term asset allocator like a pension fund or insurance company, you may not care about social impacts, but you do care about things that affects the returns on your portfolio. So when you have things happening in society that get people very upset, that affects those portfolios. And we've seen that with Brexit. We've seen that with Trump. If you're an insurance company, we've seen that with all the hurricanes that's happened in the last couple of months, right? So they do bear those costs of not paying attention to investing in the things that actually matter in society. So if you can start taking data and say, look, there are all these companies and projects out there that are doing good work. These foundations are doing good work. These NGOs are doing good work, but also these communities are doing good work. You have that data, then you can fund that and you can turn that into an investment instrument that reduces the risk to these portfolios in the long run because we're doing good. We're investing in good that reduces those kind of long-term societal shocks. So I think that's incredibly exciting in terms of what that future can look like. And if you also look at millennials, right, millennials care more than anyone else about putting their money towards social returns and sustainable returns. And millennials also like crypto. So I think there's a real opportunity here to marry that and say, look, if you can generate new forms of assets, these crypto assets based on the impact that various projects are having in the world, you can turn that into a financial instrument. That's powerful. Like imagine having an ETF that you can buy from Vanguard that comprises of these different kind of impact tokens that's backed by real impact that projects have made, right? So that's where I would like the future to look like.
Wow, that's great. So many great opportunities to use so much data for reinforcing and showing social good and putting that proof behind what really matters in society and how we support that.
Exactly.
So what would you say is the biggest challenge you're currently facing with your work in the blockchain space?
Well, I think a lot of the regulatory stuff it's challenging because, regulators are changing their tunes. And as a startup, you're like this tiny little raft in this big ocean. right? And so, you're just trying to figure out what these different regulators are doing. So I think that part can be tough. Legal fees can be tough for a small startup. But it's also an opportunity. I think long-term regulation is good because it allows for an industry to become legitimized, and therefore you're going to see a lot more capital, resources, and talent going into a certain sector. And it also allows the legitimate projects to surface and say, like, hey, we understand the laws and we understand the regulations and we're doing things properly and we're in it for the long haul. We're not here to kind of make a quick buck off people. So I think in the long run, these are all good things. But in the short term, certainly it feels, very difficult as a small startup.
Sure. What's next for your work with blockchain?
We're looking at different pilot projects that we're onboarding. So around social impact bonds, around originating carbon credits that are native to the blockchain. So I think that's super exciting. Collecting all the data, using our tools to then issue these carbon credits. So we'll see how those projects go, and I'm totally excited for the possibilities.
That's interesting. Yeah, there's just so many different possibilities out there. I feel like we're really at the beginning of blockchain's evolution, and there's just so many different ways we could go. How can people get in touch with you if they want to learn more about your work in blockchain or blockchain and how it's used for social good, things like that?
Oh, yes, definitely. You can find us at ixo.foundation or ixo.network. You'll be able to find also our white paper on the site. We've got explainer videos. You can join us on Slack or Telegram, and also follow us on Medium as well.
Wonderful. And I'll put all those links in the podcast show notes. Fennie, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast and telling your story and really helping make this whole side of blockchain come alive for us. I wish you best of luck with your pilots and all of your upcoming projects.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Beyond 6 Seconds podcast. Please subscribe to the show in iTunes or your favorite podcast player so you won't miss any episodes. You can also find all the show notes and links we discussed in this episode at our website, www.beyond6seconds.com. Until next time.